Imagine walking through a frozen forest, the bitter cold piercing through your clothes. The silence is deafening except for the occasional rustle of the wind. Suddenly, you see something that makes your heart stop, a massive grizzly bear, shivering, its powerful body tied tightly to a tree with thick chains. Its fur is matted with frost, its breathing shallow. It looks at you, not with aggression, but with desperation and fear. Who could have done this, and why? This is exactly what happened to Emily Carter, a woman who had spent years studying wildlife but had never witnessed such cruelty. What she did next would not only change her life but also defy everything people believed about grizzly bears. This is a story of courage, survival, and an unbreakable bond between a human and a wild animal. But what happened after she freed the bear will leave you speechless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring and emotional story like this. Now, let's dive into this unforgettable journey. Emily Carter wasn't afraid of the cold. She had spent most of her life in the Alaskan wilderness, tracking animals, documenting their behaviors, and fighting against illegal poaching. But that morning, something felt different. Wrapped in her thick winter coat, she trudged through the heavy snow, her boots sinking with every step. The world around her was eerily silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then she heard it, a low, almost inaudible whimper. She stopped, her heartbeat quickened. Scanning the area, she saw nothing but endless trees, their branches weighed down by snow. But the sound came again, a heartbreaking, weak cry. She followed the noise, her breath visible in the freezing air. And then she saw it, a massive grizzly bear. But something was terribly wrong. The bear was chained to a tree, its body hunched, its fur coated in ice and snow. Its powerful legs trembled, its breath slow and labored. It had been left to die. Emily felt a lump in her throat. She had seen many terrible things in the wild, but this was pure cruelty. She took a cautious step forward. The bear lifted its head weakly, its eyes meeting hers. There was no aggression, no warning growl, just pain and exhaustion. Emily's instincts screamed at her, "Help him." But how? The bear was still dangerous. If she made the wrong move, she could become its next victim. But leaving it there meant certain death for the animal. Emily had to make a choice, and she had to make it fast. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the survival knife strapped to her belt. She had freed animals from traps before, but never anything this massive. Never a grizzly bear. Her breath clouded in the freezing air as she stepped cautiously forward. The bear's eyes followed her, wary but lacking the aggression she had expected. It was as if he knew she was his only hope. Then Emily saw something that made her blood run cold. The chains around the bear's body were not old hunting snares or discarded traps. They were thick metal chains, intentionally wrapped around his torso and legs. Someone had done this on purpose. Her stomach twisted in disgust. Who would do this, and why? The bear whimpered again, shifting slightly in the snow, his massive body trembling from exhaustion and hunger. Emily knew she had very little time before the cold completely overtook him. She reached into her backpack, pulling out a small bolt cutter she always carried in case she came across illegal poacher traps. But as she kneeled next to the bear, she realized the chains were too thick. The bolt cutter barely scratched the metal. Frustration boiled inside her. She needed a stronger tool, and she needed it now. The bear let out a long, shuddering breath, his head drooping lower. Emily panicked. Was he dying right in front of her? No. She would not let this happen. Taking off her glove, she gently placed her hand on his fur, feeling the icy coldness that clung to him. She could feel his labored breathing beneath her fingers, the slow rise and fall of a body that had almost given up. "Hold on, big guy," she whispered. "I'll be right back." She sprinted toward her snowmobile, her boots slipping against the ice as she ran. The moment she reached her vehicle, she grabbed her emergency toolkit, a heavier bolt cutter and a folding saw. The minutes were ticking away. Emily rushed back to the bear, who hadn't moved. For a split second, she feared she was too late. But then she saw the slow movement of his chest, the slight flicker of his ear. He was still alive. She dropped to her knees in the snow and positioned the heavy-duty bolt cutter against the first chain. Gritting her teeth, she applied pressure, her hands freezing, her arms burning from the effort. Snap! The first link gave way. The bear flinched, letting out a deep but weak growl. Emily froze, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. But the bear did not attack. He merely shifted his body, tensing as if anticipating more pain. Emily swallowed hard and kept going. She worked as fast as she could, cutting through each chain, freeing him piece by piece. Every broken link felt like a small victory. But she wasn't done yet. The final chain was wrapped around his front legs, cutting into the skin, blood now frozen and crusted against his fur. Emily's hands trembled as she positioned the saw and began cutting away the thick metal. The bear let out a soft rumble, almost like a sigh. And then, finally, the last piece of metal fell into the snow. He was free. Emily stumbled backward, her pulse racing. The bear shifted, his muscles tensing as he tried to move for the first time in who knows how long. Would he attack her? Would he run? The grizzly lifted his head, staring at her. Then, slowly, painfully, he tried to stand. His legs shook, his body wobbled unsteadily, but he didn't collapse. Emily held her breath. This was the moment of truth. The bear turned his massive head toward her, their eyes meeting once more. There was no rage, no attack, only a silent understanding. And then, with one final look, he turned away and began to limp toward the forest. Emily exhaled sharply, her legs weak beneath her. She had done it. But one question haunted her mind: who had done this to him, and would they do it again? Emily stood in the snow, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts, watching the grizzly limp away into the forest. The thick chains lay scattered around her boots, their cold metal glistening under the weak winter sunlight. Her heart still hammered in her chest. She had done something incredibly dangerous, freeing a wild animal in distress. But she knew, deep in her gut, that she had made the right choice. But something wasn't sitting right. Who would chain a bear in the middle of nowhere? Emily scanned the area, her sharp eyes moving over the untouched snow. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of tree branches weighed down by frost. Then she saw it: footprints. They weren't bear tracks. They were human. Following the trail, Emily dropped to a crouch, examining the footprints more closely. They were fresh, leading away from the tree where the bear had been restrained. Whoever had done this had been here recently. She clenched her jaw, anger bubbling inside her. There were a lot of hunters in these woods, but no real poachers, not that she knew of. Chaining a bear like that wasn't just cruel, it was unnatural. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. No signal. Typical. The thick pines and the remote location made it impossible to call for help. She'd have to handle this on her own. With a deep breath, she followed the footprints into the forest, every step crunching softly in the snow. Emily followed the trail for nearly 15 minutes before she spotted something else: disturbed snow, deep grooves, signs of a struggle. Her stomach twisted. The bear hadn't been chained there by accident. He had been dragged. Emily's throat tightened as she took a step closer. In the churned-up snow, she saw something half buried in the frost. She knelt, brushing the snow away until her fingers touched something metallic, a spent bullet casing. Her pulse quickened. Someone had shot at the bear. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. Had they intended to kill him and failed? Had they captured him for another reason? A sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, making Emily shiver. She knew she should turn back, but something inside her refused to walk away. She had to know the truth. She continued following the trail. As the minutes passed, the footprints grew more erratic, like someone had been moving quickly, possibly running. Then, through the dense trees, she saw it, a small, isolated cabin, barely visible beneath the thick layers of snow. Smoke curled from a rusty chimney, a clear sign that someone was inside. Her hands curled into fists. Whoever lived there had to be involved. Emily took a deep breath and stepped closer, keeping to the shadows of the trees. Her instincts told her to proceed with caution. As she got near the front of the cabin, she noticed something even more chilling. Hanging on the wooden porch were multiple animal pelts: wolves, foxes, even a massive black bear skin. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a random hunter's cabin. This was the home of a poacher. And she had just walked straight into his territory. Just as Emily was about to step back, a noise from inside the cabin made her freeze. It was a low, gruff voice. Someone was talking. Her heart pounded as she crept around the side of the cabin, pressing her back against the wooden wall. She could hear them now, two voices, deep and raspy. She held her breath. "I told you," one voice growled. "The bear got loose. We should have killed it while we had the chance." Emily's blood ran cold. A second voice spoke, sounding irritated. "Damn chain snapped. Probably ran off by now. If we don't find it soon, it won't be worth a thing." Emily bit her lip to keep from gasping. They were looking for the bear. She pressed herself against the cabin wall, her mind racing. If these men found out what she had done, they wouldn't let her just walk away. And worse, they would try to track down the bear again. Emily knew she had to make a choice. Did she risk going inside and confronting the poachers, or did she try to get out of there and find the bear before they did? She had only seconds to decide. She took a deep breath, her fists tightening. She knew what she had to do, but she had to act fast. Emily's mind spun with possibilities. The weight of the situation pressed down on her. She was alone in the middle of nowhere, outside the cabin of two dangerous men who were actively searching for the same grizzly bear she had just freed. She knew one thing: if they found the bear first, it would not survive. Her breath misted in the freezing air as she pressed herself closer to the cabin's wall. She couldn't stay here. She needed to find the bear before they did. A creaking floorboard inside. Suddenly, she heard movement from inside. A heavy pair of boots thudded against the wooden floor. Then a voice. "Let's head out now before the storm picks up," one of the men muttered. Emily's stomach clenched. If she waited too long, they'd be on the move. She had to go. Now. She took a step back from the cabin, careful not to make a sound, and darted into the tree line, back into the wilderness. The cold wind cut against her skin as she moved deeper into the woods. Time was against her. She tried to retrace the bear's path, looking for signs of movement, any broken branches or tracks in the snow. The forest was vast, and the bear had been weak and exhausted. It couldn't have gotten far. Then, a set of paw prints appeared in the snow. Her heart leaped. She followed the tracks, moving quickly but carefully. The deeper she went, the more signs she noticed, small patches of disturbed snow, claw marks against tree bark. The bear was injured and slow, but it was still moving. Emily clenched her fists. She had to reach him first. The howl of a wolf, a long, eerie howl, echoed through the trees. Emily's blood ran cold. Wolves. She knew these forests well enough to recognize a hunting call. Wolves were predators, and a weak, vulnerable bear would be an easy target. Emily's feet pounded against the frozen ground as she picked up speed, ignoring the burning in her legs. The prints ahead were still fresh, leading up a narrow hill. She was getting close. Then she saw him. Collapsed in the snow at the top of a small ridge lay the grizzly bear, barely moving. His massive frame was hunched, his breath labored, his fur still damp from the snow. His eyes were half open, clouded with exhaustion. Emily felt a lump in her throat. He was giving up. And the worst part? The howls were getting closer. "Come on, big guy," she whispered, stepping toward him. "We have to move." The bear lifted his head weakly. His ribs showed through his fur, and his legs trembled as he struggled to stand. Emily reached out carefully, keeping her movements slow and steady. She knew she couldn't force him to move, but she could help, a desperate attempt to save him. She pulled off her backpack, grabbed a protein bar, and tore it open with her teeth. Extending it toward the bear, she hoped the scent would stir him. His nose twitched. She prayed he had enough strength left to eat. The bear inched forward, taking a hesitant sniff. Then, with shaky movements, he took a bite. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He was still fighting. But they weren't safe yet. A snap of branches in the distance sent her heart into a frenzy. She whirled around, eyes scanning the trees. Something was coming. It could be the wolves. It could be the poachers. Either way, she was running out of time. She turned back to the bear. "Come on, buddy. You have to trust me." With a groan, the bear pushed himself up, his muscles shaking. Emily felt a surge of relief. Then she heard it. A gunshot. Her body froze. The poachers were closer than she thought. Looking back at her expectantly, Emma stared. Was it waiting for her? Her mind warred with itself. This was a wild animal, it owed her nothing. Yet, it had led her to shelter last night, and now it seemed to be leading her somewhere else. With no better options, she followed. The bear moved with purpose, navigating the uneven terrain with ease. Emma struggled to keep up, her legs still aching from the previous day's exhaustion. As they walked, she noticed the forest was eerily quiet, no distant hum of cars, no planes overhead, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. After what felt like an eternity, she heard something, a faint trickling sound. Water. Emma's chest tightened with relief. The bear had led her to a small stream, its clear waters flowing over smooth rocks. Emma didn't hesitate, she dropped to her knees, cupping the cold water in her hands and drinking deeply. The cool liquid soothed her parched throat, giving her the strength she desperately needed. She glanced at the bear, which had stepped into the shallow water, lapping up a drink of its own. Emma sat back, watching it with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. This creature, this powerful, wild beast, was helping her. Not attacking. Not ignoring her. But why? As she stared, a realization hit her. It wasn't just protecting her, it was keeping her alive. She didn't know how long she would be out here or if she would ever make it back to civilization, but one thing was clear: this bear had become her only hope. And for now, she would trust it. Emma wiped the cool water from her lips, her mind racing as she watched the bear. It had saved her life twice now, first by leading her to the cave and now by bringing her to water. She couldn't explain it. Was it instinct? Coincidence? Or was there something deeper at play? Whatever the reason, she knew one thing for sure: without the bear, she wouldn't have survived the night. Her stomach growled again, louder this time. Water had eased her thirst, but hunger gnawed at her, making her feel weak and lightheaded. She glanced around, searching for anything edible: berries, mushrooms, anything that wouldn't poison her. She knew nothing about foraging, and the thought of eating something toxic terrified her. As if sensing her desperation, the bear suddenly moved. It stepped out of the water, shaking droplets from its thick fur, and lumbered toward the trees. Emma hesitated before following, wondering where it was taking her this time. The bear led her deeper into the forest, its massive paws silent on the damp earth. Emma struggled to keep up, her bare arms scraped by low-hanging branches. Then, after a short walk, the bear stopped near a cluster of bushes. Emma watched as it pushed its nose into the foliage, sniffing the small, bright berries growing there. It huffed softly before stepping aside. Emma's heart pounded. Was it showing her food? She hesitated. Could she trust it? Did it even know what was safe for her to eat? The bear watched her, unmoving. Swallowing her fear, she reached out and plucked a berry. She rolled it between her fingers, its deep color almost glistening in the morning light. Carefully, she put it to her lips and took a small bite. The burst of sweetness filled her mouth, and to her relief, there was no bitter aftertaste. She waited a moment, bracing herself for any signs of poisoning, dizziness, nausea, anything, but nothing happened. Encouraged, she grabbed a handful, eating greedily. The fruit wasn't enough to fill her completely, but it gave her energy, just enough to keep moving. She glanced at the bear, a strange sense of understanding passing between them. It had given her shelter. It had led her to water. And now, it had shown her food. Emma took a shaky breath, trying to grasp the impossible reality she was living in. She wasn't just surviving in the wilderness, she was surviving because of this bear. As the morning stretched on, Emma followed her unlikely guardian through the forest. The bear moved with steady purpose, never straying too far, always keeping her within sight. It wasn't taming her, and it wasn't treating her like another bear. But it wasn't treating her like prey either. Somehow, they had formed an unspoken bond. The hours passed in a haze of exhaustion and hunger, but Emma kept moving, trusting the bear's silent guidance. Then, just as the sun reached its peak, she heard something that made her freeze. Voices. Distant. Faint. But unmistakably human. Her heart leaped. She wasn't alone anymore. Hope surged through her veins as she turned toward the sound. But as she took a step forward, she hesitated. The bear. It stood still, watching her, its dark eyes unreadable. Emma's breath caught in her throat. If she left now, this would be the last time she ever saw it. This creature had saved her, protected her, and now she was about to walk away. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but words felt meaningless. The bear huffed, a low, deep sound that rumbled through its chest. Then, without another glance, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Emma felt her chest ache as she watched it go, but she knew she had no choice. With one last look at the place that had nearly become her grave and her salvation, she turned and ran toward the voices. The world she had known was waiting for her. But she would never forget the guardian she had left behind. Emma's legs burned as she sprinted toward the voices, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest blurred around her, trees and underbrush flashing past as adrenaline pushed her forward. She didn't know how far the voices were or who they belonged to. All she knew was that she had to reach them before they disappeared. "Help!" she shouted, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and dehydration. "I'm here. Please." Her feet stumbled over a thick root, and she nearly fell, but she caught herself just in time. The voices were closer now, clearer. They weren't just echoes in her head. These were real people. Then, through the gaps in the trees, she saw them, two men in bright orange vests, carrying radios and wearing heavy-duty boots. They stood near a clearing, their backs turned, unaware of her presence. But Emma knew without a doubt these were search and rescue workers. She let out a sob of relief. "Please, over here," she called, forcing herself forward. One of the men whipped around at the sound of her voice, his eyes widening. In an instant, they were running toward her. "Oh my God," one of them breathed as he caught her before she collapsed. "It's her. We found her." Emma barely had the strength to respond. Her body sagged with exhaustion, her limbs trembling. She felt someone wrap a jacket around her, and another voice spoke into a radio. "We have her. Repeat, we have the missing woman. She's alive. Alive." The word sent a shiver through her. She had been so close to death, yet somehow she had survived, not because of her own skills or sheer luck, but because of the bear. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned her head back toward the forest, searching for the familiar shadow that had become her protector. But it was gone. She wasn't sure what she had expected. The bear had done its part. It had led her to safety, guided her when she had been too weak to go on, and now, it had disappeared into the wilderness where it belonged. As the rescuers guided her toward an ATV waiting on the outskirts of the clearing, Emma felt the weight of everything settle on her chest, the betrayal, the fear, the hunger, the exhaustion. She had been left to die, but something wild, something beyond logic, had refused to let that happen. One of the rescuers handed her a bottle of water, and she took slow, careful sips, the cool liquid soothing her raw throat. "We've been looking for you for days," one of the men said gently. "Your husband reported you missing, said you never came back from a hike." Emma's grip on the bottle tightened. "Daniel." The mention of his name made her stomach churn with anger, but more than that, with determination. He had done this to her. He had left her in the middle of nowhere, expecting her to die. He had walked away without a second thought, taking all of their supplies, assuming she wouldn't make it. But she had. And now, he was about to face the consequences. The ride back to civilization was a blur. The ATV rumbled over the rough terrain, and then she was in an ambulance, wrapped in blankets, an oxygen mask pressed to her face. She barely processed the beeping of medical equipment or the gentle reassurances of the paramedics. Her mind was fixed on one thing: Daniel. When they arrived at the hospital, reporters were already swarming the entrance, their cameras flashing, their voices blending into a chaotic buzz of questions. "How did you survive? What happened in the forest? Is it true your husband abandoned you? Emma didn't answer. Not yet. She had a more important conversation to have first. The moment she was stable, two detectives entered her hospital room, their expressions serious. "Mrs. Clark," one of them said. "We need to ask you about what happened in the forest." Emma took a deep breath. "I'll tell you everything," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. And she did. She told them about the trip, about how Daniel had been acting distant, how he had led her deep into the woods only to leave her there with no supplies. She recounted every detail, the betrayal, the desperation, the nights spent alone. But then, she told them something else. She told them about the bear. At first, they exchanged skeptical glances, but the more she spoke, the more they listened. She described how it had found her, how it had led her to shelter, to water, to food. How, in the darkest moment of her life, when a human had abandoned her, a wild animal had chosen to save her. By the time she finished, the detectives were silent. Then, one of them nodded. "We'll handle Daniel." Those words sent a wave of relief through her. She didn't have to fight this battle alone. Justice would come for the man who had tried to kill her. Over the next few days, her story spread like wildfire. News outlets couldn't get enough of it. "Wife abandoned in the wilderness, saved by a bear." The headlines screamed. Experts debated whether the bear had truly understood what it was doing or if it had been mere coincidence. But Emma knew the truth. It had been no accident. A week later, as she stood in front of the hospital window, staring out at the open landscape, she felt something stir inside her. She couldn't just walk away from this. The forest had changed her. The bear had changed her. She knew she had to go back, not to live in fear of what had happened, but to thank the guardian that had saved her life. The moment Emma's story spread, public outrage erupted like wildfire. News outlets, social media platforms, and talk shows all picked up the shocking tale of a husband who had deliberately abandoned his wife in the wilderness, expecting her never to return. The details were too shocking to ignore: a man who had planned his wife's death so he could claim her inheritance, only for her to survive against all odds. People were furious, demanding justice for Emma. Daniel had played the grieving husband well, at first. When he reported her missing, he had sobbed in front of the cameras, pretending to be devastated. He had even joined search parties, answering questions with carefully crafted lies. But his act began to fall apart the moment Emma was found alive. The police wasted no time launching an official investigation. Detectives dug into his financial records and uncovered damning evidence: large withdrawals made days before their trip and, more disturbingly, a life insurance policy he had taken out in Emma's name just months before. The policy was set to pay out a massive sum in the event of her accidental death. With this evidence, detectives confronted Daniel. At first, he denied everything. He tried to twist the story, claiming Emma had run off, that she had gotten lost on her own. But the evidence told a different story. Witnesses, friends, and family came forward, revealing that Daniel had always been controlling. Some even admitted that he had spoken about Emma's inheritance in a way that raised suspicions. His fate was sealed when Emma took the stand. Sitting in the courtroom, she faced the man who had left her for dead. She told the jury everything: how he had been distant before the trip, how he had walked away from her in the middle of nowhere without a word, how he had taken the only supplies and left her with no way to survive. She recounted the sheer terror of that first night, the overwhelming loneliness, the bitter realization that the man she loved had wanted her to die. But then, she spoke about the bear. She told them how, when a human had abandoned her, a wild animal had chosen to protect her. How, instead of attacking, it had led her to shelter, brought her to water, and given her the strength to survive. Some people in the courtroom scoffed at the idea. Others were captivated. But Emma didn't care whether they believed it or not. The bear had saved her life. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty. Daniel was sentenced to 25 years in prison for attempted murder and fraud. As the judge read the sentence, Emma sat still, absorbing the weight of it. She had won. Justice had been served. But no prison sentence could erase the betrayal, the nightmares, the nights she had spent shivering in fear. She had survived. Not because of the man who had once vowed to love her. She had survived because of something greater. In the months following the trial, Emma found herself unable to return to the life she once had.